Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming and joining us this afternoon. I want to introduce our guest speaker and who we'll be having a conversation with today. Dr. Evelyn Farkas has 3 decades of experience working on national security and foreign policy in the U.S. at the executive and legislative branches, in the private sector, and for international organizations overseas. She served from 2012 to 2015 as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. From 2010 to 2012, she was a Senior Advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe and Special Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for the NATO Summit. Prior to that, she was the Executive Director of the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism, and Senior Fellow of the American Security Project. Before that, she served as a staff member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Prior to this, she was a professor of international relations at the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College. And she has published numerous academic and opinion pieces on foreign policy and national security. She speaks Hungarian, German, studied French, Spanish, Serbo-Croatian, Russian, and Hindi. Farkas is here, which is really interesting to me, is she ran for New York's 17th Congressional District, the House of Representatives, 2019 and 2020. And then she also sits on a bunch of boards for service. So she's very busy. We are so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much. And I hope I said that you are now the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. That's what she's doing now. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Woodall. Thank you to the center, to Dr. Hinojosa, who is here as well, and for this invitation. I am the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. It is an institute that is inspired by the memory of and the example of the late Senator John McCain, who was, as you probably know, longtime senator from this great state of Arizona, but really made a reputation globally for his advocacy for human rights and democracy. So at the Institute, we focus on human rights, democracy, and character-driven leadership. We are under the umbrella of ASU. We're very proud members of ASU. We're located in Washington, D.C., so I travel back and forth here. And I am really a Washington, D.C. person, but I did run for office in New York in 2020. And so I will just start by giving you a little bit of background, and then obviously Dr. Woodall will ask me questions, and I'd love to hear your questions as well. And you really can ask whatever you would like to ask, not just about my experience running for Congress. But I think what's important to know is that this explains why I ran for Congress. It also explains why I'm running the McCain Institute. I am passionate about democracy. To me, democracy means freedom, the freedom to express yourself politically, the freedom to express yourself economically, so to pursue free enterprise. And it was something that my parents didn't have. They were born in, well, my mother was born during the war. My father was born in 1925, and he's still alive. And if you do the math, he's almost 97. But my parents came under the influence, if you will. They came under the communist system, which was not a free system. And in 1956, there was a revolution. The Hungarian people revolted because at the time, communism was not just a Hungarian imposed thing. They were also under the influence of the Soviet Union. The revolution failed, and about 250,000 Hungarians fled the country. Most of these were intellectuals, people who were educated, people who wanted freedom to achieve, to get ahead, to not be considered enemies of the people, which they had been considered as such under communism. So my parents came here, and I grew up. My first language was Hungarian. That's why I speak fluent Hungarian. I grew up in my parents' house, the first child. So I did not learn English until I went to kindergarten. But what I knew was, I knew that there was this other world in Hungary. My grandparents were still caught, in that communist system. And I knew it wasn't free. I knew as a 10-year-old when I went to Hungary and I was speaking out to my grandparents, my parents would say, shh, that lady next door, be careful what you say, you could get your grandparents in trouble. And I knew it wasn't like someone's going to yell at my grandparents. I knew it was a trouble that would involve taking them away to a prison and maybe we wouldn't see them again. So as a child, I felt very strongly, obviously, about being in America as opposed to being somewhere else. And so that has motivated me throughout my life and probably also determined the fact that I would get involved in international affairs and foreign policy and work for the US government. So fast forward to 2019, why did I run for Congress? Well, I was, of course, experienced at that point. I'm 54 now, so you can do the math. I was experienced person when it came to foreign policy, when it came to the US government. I knew how things worked. I was very concerned at that point about the state of our democracy. So not to get overly political, but I disagreed with President Trump and his policies. I felt that if he won another term, that he would take our country in the wrong direction. And I was actually in Tbilisi, Georgia. We had an annual conference that the McCain Institute puts on in Tbilisi, Georgia, which is basically between Iran and Europe. It's called Eurasia, that part of the world. And we were talking to the politicians there in Georgia about basically opposition politics. They were running for parliament. And at one point, one of my colleagues said to them, well, what's your plan B? What are you going to do if you don't win? And they said, oh, no, we'll win. And then I went to bed. And when you go to Tbilisi, Georgia, and you're on East Coast New York time or DC time, you wake up at 4 a.m. And I thought, oh, my God, what's my plan B? What happens if Trump, who I think is bad for democracy, wins? I said, okay, Evelyn, no problem. You'll move back to New York, where I grew up and where my parents are still in Westchester County, and I'll get involved in politics. That's how I'll fight, if you will, and because I know how government works. Well, just about a month later, my long-term Congresswoman, Nita Lowey, she was an 84-year-old, about 84, and she won her seat in about 1984. She announced that she was retiring. It was pretty sudden. It was in October. So think about it. We had primaries in June of 2019 before the elections. No, sorry, 2020. So she was actually saying that she was resigning pretty late in the contest. That was because there was a young man challenging her who was very energetic, who was running around, actually making some inroads. And she, I think, realized, okay, I'm 84. And I don't have the energy to run around meeting with everyone. And so she thought, you know what, I'm going to retire. I'm reading between the lines a little bit here, because that is, of course, not what she said, but that was the interpretation from most of us. And in any event, she was very well thought of. She was very center, worked across the aisle with Republicans and Democrats, was well respected. The district, in fact, is a district that's not, it's Democratic, but it's very center, and even, can swing Republican occasionally. So for me as a centrist, it was a natural place I came from there. And when she said she was resigning, a bunch of my friends said, you should run. So fast forward, what does it take to convince someone to run? The local politicians, of course, had to convince me. And then I had to talk to some operatives. The local politicians who wanted me to run said, look, you're a woman. She's a woman, she's leaving. Right now, we only have this male candidate at that moment in time, though other people jumped in. And we actually had 15 people at one point, then it shrunk to 13. By the time the ballot was printed, there were 8 of us running, but actually there was a 9th person on the ballot because she didn't drop out early enough to be off the ballot. Anyway, it was an open seat. So usually when there's an open seat, a lot of people run because it's an opportunity, right? You're not challenging an incumbent that everybody knows already and has a lot of money and power. So I had to, of course, have the support of local people who wanted to elect me. But I learned I also needed other things. I needed to raise money and I needed to build a campaign team. And so that's really the first step if you're going to run. And raising money means asking all your friends and then everyone you know. And if you are at that point in your 50s, as I was, you know more people and you know more people who have built up some wealth, which is always good. You want to be able to ask as many people for help. And you're not asking them to help you necessarily. You're asking them to help further your agenda. And my argument was, look, I know how Washington works. On day one, I can make change happen. It will be almost like having an incumbent because I know how things work. I know the members of Congress. I know their staffers. I'll walk in the door and I'll be able to do business for the district. Also, I really care. You know, I am a second generation American. I understand many of the issues that people in the district face because New York, of course, is a state with a lot of immigration. And then being a woman didn't hurt, although it turns out it wasn't actually that important in the end. So how did I do and what are some lessons learned? I'll skip ahead to that. How did I do? I came in third, although my sister likes to say, and she was not neutral, she was heavily involved in my campaign. She liked to say, well, if you round you up and the other second place guy down, you tied him for second. So the guy who won was a man named Mondaire Jones. He served one term and he's still in Congress, but he lost his reelection because he actually had to run in another district. That had to do with redistricting and the fact that he was suddenly going to have to compete against a much more powerful member of Congress. He likely would have lost that race. So he ran for another open seat, but he lost that seat. The dynamics were very different for him than in our race. He won by 41.9% of the vote. In New York, you don't have to be over 50%. You just have to have the plurality, which means the highest percentage. So he had the highest percentage at 41.9. Some states, you have to get 50, you have to have a runoff to get to 50. And then the next guy after me was the son of the CEO of Regeneron, which is a big pharmaceutical company located in Westchester. Like me, he had moved away and then came back to the district to run. For neither one of us was that actually a big issue, oddly enough, because there's so much migration in and out of New York. People didn't seem to mind that we were, strictly speaking, you could characterize us as carpetbaggers. He won with he got 16.3% of the electorate, and then I got 15.6. There were a lot of lessons learned in this campaign, and I'll just list them out for you, and then we can delve into some of them more in depth as you are interested, as Dr. Woodall's interests drive us, and of course your own interests. So the first lesson I learned is that unlike other jobs that you interview for and you try to get, history actually has a big role in whether you get this job. So the first thing was COVID. I'm running in 2019. Everything seems great, all the way from when I entered the race in November, all the way up until March of 2020. Suddenly we're in COVID, and we're actually at the point where you're about to go door to door and really start interacting, because the first couple of months, you're actually raising money. You're raising money for the all-important TV ads. So we were hit by COVID. Well, I had not built up a field campaign up to that point, meaning people who could go door to door, and an army of people who would spread the word in person to voters. The gentleman who had entered the race, as I mentioned before, who was already challenging the incumbent, he'd been in the race 6 months before the rest of us. So the winner actually had a field advantage. We ended up, so I ended up having to pivot, we all did, to Zoom campaigning. And with Zoom, you don't cover territory the same way, right? So one of the conundrums that my sister very smartly figured out was, well, how do you go from town to town? So she came up with something we called the Whistle Stop Tour, and we invited people on Zoom from different towns at different times. And we tried that way to kind of cover the geography. The second historical thing that hit us was the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, it was already a movement, but there was a resurgence of interest in Black Lives Matter and a much more unified Black, white, brown, Asian, everyone on board after the killing of George Floyd. So that happened in May of 2020. So all of a sudden, the attention, national attention, the district attention was on how do we help, essentially, how do we become anti-racist? How do we help our fellow citizens who have been suffering from structural racism to essentially address these inequalities? And the front runner was a Black man, and obviously I'm not a Black man. So there was that dynamic also in terms of history shining a light on one candidate over the other. If it had been the Me Too movement, for a woman at that point in time, I might have been the candidate that people might have looked to for leadership or for a voice. So that was really interesting to me, that history, history has an impact on you if you're running for a public office like that. The second thing was money, and we could talk more about that, but I've already mentioned it's really important to raise money because the best way to reach the highest number of people, whether you like it or not, is TV ads. The second best way is in people's mailboxes. Both of those things are very expensive, especially depending on where your district is, what the market is. So if you're in an urban area, those television ads cost more. And certainly for where we were located, they were expensive enough. I did raise in 6 months 1.4 million, well, total $1.4 million. In 6 months, I raised, I think it was $250,000, in 6 weeks. So it was very quickly, I raised enough money to get the attention of Emily's List. And Emily's List came on board and endorsed me, which is quite rare in a primary because they figure the Democrat is going to endorse the Emily's List agenda, which, as you know, is basically centered on pro-choice agenda and women's rights, broadly speaking. In this case, of course, the men were Democrats and they all said that they would support the agenda, but they still wanted, Emily's List still likes to elevate women to positions of authority in politics. So they decided I had enough of a shot because I had raised all that money and I could get on television that they would endorse me in the primary. And they also recognized, in fact, that I did know how to work Washington, so I would likely be an effective member of Congress if I were elected. The next thing I learned was listen to consultants, but also listen to your gut. So there's this whole army of people. They're basically based in Washington, D.C. They don't know your district. They don't know your state, but they think they're experts anyway. And they are experts on certain things. They're definitely right that you have to spend money on television, but they're not right all the time. And they were consistently telling me not to worry about Facebook ads, not to worry about social media, and downplaying the role of the field. And in my gut, I felt like, I don't know, I feel like I need to get out there and meet more people. And in essence, it turns out I think I was right, but the consultants had more of an interest in having me get on television and do the mailings because they actually benefited from that. The way their contracts were structured, they would get a cut of that type of spending. The last thing I would say before I turn it over to you, Dr. Woodall, is you should, if you're running for office, as I said, you have to have the motivation. I've outlined my motivations. You have to have the organization. You have to have the ability to raise the money. And then it really, really helps to have someone with you on the campaign who has your back. And that's like for any level, whether you're running for student Congress, which, by the way, that is how I started in high school. And then in college, I was in student government. And then I took a long hiatus from politics. But it very much helps to have somebody who has your back, somebody who will be honest with you, somebody who you can vent to and get advice from, because campaigning and politics can be really personal, really draining, and you don't oftentimes know who's giving you good advice, and you need someone to confide in, someone to, pick you up. It can be very lonely, especially if you're in the middle of a pandemic where you can't even hug your family and friends or see them. So that is my last kind of lesson learned. I had my sister who was not even in state. She was in Maryland, but she was on the phone with me. She took 6 months off to help me with my campaign. And it made all the difference in the world because she was smart, she was capable, and she had my back.
Sounds like an amazing sister.
She was, yeah. She is.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks for, gosh, you answered a lot of my questions that I had. So I'm going to ask you some other things that we talked about in class and that I'm interested in as well. Because you were running for a seat that was held by the next maybe, so I don't know if maybe if you experienced and any of the voters or the media, I don't know how much media attention was on it. Primaries, media. But if you experienced any gender stereotypes, or did people double standards against your male opponents, or did you notice anything, or no, seem like in that regard?
So first of all, in a positive sense, it was really interesting because one of the local leader who really convinced me to run was a 30-something Asian American male. And he said to me, I really think you need to run because I think we need a woman and we need an experienced woman. So he felt strongly, and he very much continues to be a mover and a shaker in the community, that Nita Lowy was a path breaker, that she was a unifier. There was something about the gender that he thought was important. And so he really was one of the people who convinced me more than many of the others. Also because he was young, and I thought people my age would understand why I might be an effective congressperson, but the fact that he understood meant something. On the negative side of the ledger, well, I mentioned already some of the front runners who were running against me. One of them at one point got a little heated in a debate and actually blurted out, he called me a snake. And it was very venomous of him, the way he said it. And when we sat back and thought about it on my team, women and men alike, we felt like there was something mildly sexist about it, because to us it evoked Adam and Eve and that sneaky woman, who brought down civilization, by tempting him with that apple, right? That biblical story. Why did he call me a snake? And I wasn't being sneaky, I didn't think, but whatever he was. So that was a point I remember very clearly. And we did then, of course, do what you do. We fundraised off of it. We said, well, now I feel like Hillary Clinton, and she lives in the district. So that was a negative example. But generally speaking, I didn't feel, we had a lot of women in the race. I was the front runner, but I didn't feel that it made that much of a difference.
In your expertise, so in security or policy, what about enactment? So your competencies are on issues that espouse this about in class, this masculinized ethos, right? Mm-hmm. So where traditionally it's heavily male dominated. Your expertise and just going up the ranks to get to the bar, what was that experience?
Well, so this is interesting because I think probably the reason why maybe I had an easier time as a female candidate was that I had been working in a traditionally male environment. So I had credibility on issues that my competitors didn't have. And these were male-oriented issues like defense and national security, and even to some extent foreign policy. So I think that helped. I will say that I have become tough throughout my career as a woman in my career. So when I first moved down to Washington, D.C., my first job, I was a professor. I taught Marines. I actually learned to identify them by the back of their heads because they all wore the same thing to school every day, their uniform. They were a master's level, but I will never forget that towards the end of one of the years when I was teaching, one of the students came up to me who was from Senegal. So that was also interesting because he was African. And, we tend to think, oh, we're really women's Libby here, or we're more, forward thinking. And I don't really know how they think about women in Senegal. But what was interesting to me was he said to me, ma'am, I have to tell you, when you first walked into the classroom, I thought you were a student, he said, but I forget how he put it, but he basically expressed to me how much he valued my knowledge and the class. And what I learned in that job, I would walk in the room with zero credibility because I was 30 years old. And there were these, white-haired men that they were used to hearing from. I was only the second woman professor they'd ever had in their system. So that was something that made me tough. And then later on, when I came out of the Obama administration, remember I had the Russia portfolio. Well, I came out of the Obama administration, President Obama was still in the White House, my colleagues were still in the government, and all of a sudden there was this Russia's interfering in the elections. So I got on national television and I explained how Vladimir Putin operates. And I explained what might be happening with the Trump campaign in as much as we were hearing that that Russians were trying to meet with them and vice versa. And so in explaining how this might work, I got not only the Russian government mad at me, but obviously some of the Trump supporters mad at me. And that meant a lot of like hate tweeting and coming after me in the press. And I really had to rally my Republican friends who knew me, and I had a lot of credibility with them, to explain that I'm not some political hack. I'm literally explaining how Putin operates, and in that context, what's happening with that Republican candidate. And so the controversy blew over, but it really made me tough. So when I ran for Congress, I'd already had all these, nasty Russians and far right people from all around the world, including our country, saying things about me that were horrible. And I learned to just dismiss it because I knew I was right about what I was talking about. I knew I didn't have any nefarious agenda. I was trying to explain to the American people and defend our democracy.
Thank you. And then that was actually one of my other questions. So that's really defending them. Then, as you said, you were the first one to sound the alarm on Russian interference in that 2016 election. And so I'm wondering where, especially now, kind of looking back, where character-driven leadership, first of all, what is character-driven leadership and how has that kind of focused you, particularly on ethics?
Yeah. So first of all, it's character-driven leadership, or another way of putting it is integrity-driven leadership, means you hew to your values. Everything you do and you say, the way you vote, whatever you do, your actions as a leader reflect your values. So for me, it was easy. I stood up and said, this is what Vladimir Putin's doing. He's attacking our democracy. And if I saw other people doing it, I wouldn't be afraid. I would say the same thing, even if they were Americans. And so character-driven leadership means being outspoken, being strong, and standing up for what you know is true and what you believe is valuable. So it's sticking to your values. And that's what Senator McCain did all the time. He spoke up also for other people who are doing the same thing. Primarily in other countries, that was what he was really known for, speaking up for dissidents who were in jail, people like Vladimir Kara-Murza or Alexei Navalny, these are Russians in jail, and many others. I'm trying to think, there was some other part of your question that I wanted to answer. I know, I did want to mention that the Russians interfered with my election. I don't know if you were going to ask me about that, but so so there are a couple of things I have to tell you guys. On October 18th, we're going to have a program here on campus to McCain Institute together with the German Marshall Fund to talk about foreign interference in US democracy. And it's real. It happens every day on Twitter. If you see people arguing, many times those are bots, or those are people who are motivated by, egged on by other bots or foreigners. And they're not necessarily just Russian. They could be Chinese, they could be Iranian, and they're trying to get us to fight with one another. All the tension we have in politics has been fueled by and exacerbated by, made worse by these foreign actors. In my case, the Russians, of course, didn't like me because I was always pointing a finger and saying things about them that were true, that were explaining to Americans why they were trying to hurt our democracy. And so when I ran for Congress, one of their operatives in the US who's been identified by the State Department and been interviewed by the FBI, wrote an op-ed and he put it online on one of the local online kind of news, what used to be a newspaper, but is now an online newspaper, and attacked me. Now, that did not affect the outcome of the election because people really didn't care and they weren't paying attention. It was more to try to intimidate me and to show me, oh, we're watching you. But the Russians do interfere, and that's the reality.
Talk a lot about that in another class. In the spring, if you're back here in the spring, we need to talk about that. I guess the other question I have, and this is for all, I think, young people, I'm not taking one of their questions, but how do you convince young people in the polarized environment that we have, in an environment where we have foreign interference in our elections, and you feel kind of helpless, there's not much you can do about it, maybe as a candidate. How do you convince them to keep running, to run, to keep engaged, to participate?
Oh, you're giving me a segue to another event that the McCain Institute is hosting. So this is not yet public, but it is for students to talk exactly about this, how to engage and how to stay engaged and not give up on democracy. So Liz Cheney, Representative Cheney, is coming to campus, being hosted by us on October 5th. It's only open to students and maybe select professors, and you have to register to get invited. Did you get it? Okay, great. So that's exactly what she's doing right now. I mean, she knew she was going to lose, but this is integrity-driven or character-driven leadership. She said, I don't care. What is right to me is saying what I'm saying, sticking up for democracy, and telling my party that they've gone down a wrong path. You know, they are denying the outcome of the elections, which every state and every court validated. And so I can't stand for that. I'm not going to, you know, essentially say what some people want me to say, which is a lie. And so she lost because her party in Wyoming is basically saying what the former president wants them to say, which is not true. And so she stuck to her guns because she also, you know, she knows history. I mean, her father was our vice president. She knows that history is long. And if you study history, you know, there were times when we had more demagogic or fascist light, or certainly real fascist in Europe. And eventually the tide will turn. So her view is you keep speaking the truth until there's the right moment. And then everyone realizes, and then everyone pretends they were with you all along, but that's okay. So, I mean, the tide will turn back to the truth because the lie doesn't serve anyone. Eventually, you want public servants who go in to serve, to make life better for their constituents, not to try to get on television, not to try to fight with one another, not to just have power for power's sake. And I do think, generally speaking, this is a broad generalization, but women are often more trusted. They are less, generally speaking, corrupt or like cheating on their spouses and things like that. So there is a tendency also for women to be able to get that message across in a way that men can't. So women running for Congress, there's sometimes really a moment for them, or running for any office. So I would say, but the bottom line is, if you stick to your values, you're always going to feel good, even if you're losing. You have to know what's true to you. If you start making compromises and they're not true to your values, you'll feel it. And you will feel, you know, potentially physically sick, but certainly mentally you won't feel well.
You've been very successful, right? Like, this is my last question, and then we'll get your questions. You've been, you know, very successful throughout career and everything, and then you did not win that
Yes, I was a loser.
I mean, is that like, how did you feel about that? And what did you learn? Did you learn anything new about yourself from that, or it's kind of, what was that like?
So, well, two things. One, I left out the fact that when I left my job on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and then I went to run this small commission, which was the child of the 9/11 Commission. It was like a startup. I got a budget, and then they were like, "Good, go find an office and go find people, and you have to figure out how to do this." And it was really intimidating and scary. And after that job, I said to myself, my God, if I did this, and I did, in 9 months, we had a book. I mean, we did it. And I said, my God, if I did this, I can do anything. And that's why I had also the courage to run for Congress, that I had done this other thing that to me was insane and hard. And since I did that, when I wasn't sure I could, it told me I could run for Congress. When I ran, as I mentioned, you know, I was already 50, or 51, I guess I can't do my math. But I knew that there are many ways to contribute to society. And I had already done a lot of them, right? I'd already had lots of jobs. So I knew, look, if I don't win, it's going to be okay. I'll find something else to do. I'll find some other way to defend democracy, which of course is what happened. And on the personal front, I ended up moving back to Washington, D.C. I spent a lot of time, because it was COVID, with just a few people. And one of them ended up becoming my husband. So So personally, it worked out really well for me. You know, I got married this year at the first time, age of 54. And I also got this fantastic job where I can defend democracy as well. So for me, I just had a different attitude because of my place in life. But I think even if you're younger, you can have that attitude of, okay, if this doesn't work, I'll find another thing. And that's generally a helpful way to approach life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering all of those questions. And I think we will start with questions. Should we start with in-person questions?
Yeah, let's start with in-person, and front row is active already. And then if people don't hear you, I can repeat the question. So please.
Hi, my name is Michaela, and I was just wondering if you think that like all of your experience, obviously you've had a significant amount of experience before you ran, and if you think that that truly makes a difference in women candidates specifically, when like do you think they have a better chance when they're older with experience, or do you think that they still have a chance on the younger spectrum with not a lot of experience?
That was a really good question. So for those who didn't hear it, Michaela asked whether I think it helps that I had all this experience when I was running. Would a younger female candidate encounter a harder time, essentially? And I think actually you're onto something, because I watch my male counterparts, whether it's running for Congress or advancing up in government, they advance much more quickly into senior positions, and women have to gain the experience. You can look at Hillary Clinton, you know, she became Secretary of State, had to be older, although of course other ones like John Kerry were not young either. You look at the current National Security Advisor, excuse me, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his first name, Jake Sullivan, I know him. He's pretty young. I don't think at my age I would have been selected for that position. And I don't know that there would have been another woman at that age selected for that position. So I do think, unfortunately, there's still kind of a bias towards giving men a little more credibility, and they can advance at a younger age. Yes. Sorry.
So you mentioned how history played a pretty big role in your election in 2020. In the midterms, how much of a role do you think the recent decision regarding Roe v. Wade is going to impact women running, women being, and just women being active in general?
Okay, so Hugh asked about the recent decision, the Dobbs decision on Roe v. Wade, which overturned Roe v. Wade. How much will that impact the midterm elections in the US this year? Certainly, Hugh, it will motivate a lot of women to be engaged and involved, and the men that love them and care about this issue. I would imagine, I don't know if it will result in people running for office, because that depends, because you often need some time, and we're getting close now to the elections. But in terms of turnout, most political scientists believe that turnout will be boosted in places where women think that they're losing their rights. Some of it will hinge on the dynamic in the state. So, for example, in New York, you may not have as many people turning out because we have a Democratic governor, and so people don't think it's at risk. But in Arizona, this is a place where first of all of the elections here, as far as I can tell, and you guys can correct me, are going to be close. And so in that case, the Democrats are definitely helped by the Dodd decision, because their turnout will be spiked. But, you know, you also have to know that, you know, where are we in October? So there's still time, and anything can happen. You know, remember the Black Lives Matter movement happened in May, and then we had June 23rd was our primary. We didn't see it coming, and we didn't see the impact it would have. So, so you don't really know what will happen. And of course, for the Biden administration and Democrats, they're looking at what will happen, well, and Republicans, everyone's looking also at the national level, what will happen with the economy, you know, what will happen with interest rates, what will happen with inflation. And frankly, for the first time in a while, I think foreign policy counts, because President Biden has been often portrayed as weak and certainly weak on foreign policy, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal. But now that Ukraine is prevailing so far, and we really have rallied the international community, a lot of it at least, behind Ukraine, that could be something that could sway some independents to say, okay, let's just stick with the Democrats. But at the end of the day, it's probably going to be much more local issues that determine it, which means the issue of choice will be on the ballot for a lot of places. Oh, I'm sorry, and then you next to him, and then behind you. Oh, thank you.
Okay. I was just curious to know your stance on specifically, for example, the Roe v. Wade and how that might influence female candidates. How do you feel about identity politics in general? Do you feel as if identity politics either hinder politicians and the political realm specifically, or do you think it's something that's necessary for, female candidates, people of color specifically? How do you feel that influence has been throughout the years?
I mean, I think, so identity politics is a little bit of a laden term. It's sort of like woke, like it sounds, some people paint it as a bad thing. I think at the end of the day, you have to run as the authentic person you are, but you are also trying to connect with other people. So you want to show empathy. The way I tried to show empathy was showing my biography to say, look, I know what it's like to grow up having to worry about financial issues, in the household, because that's how we grew up in my household, right? So part of the biography, the identity, or being a woman, it does signal to people that you understand them, and you don't just understand them, you empathize. So identity is important. People want to know who you are and what you stand for and how you feel about them. I do think that it's important to have diversity in our leaders in America because we're a diverse country. We can't have all white politicians, we're not an all white country. And so we want, and for the youth to feel invested and motivated, they have to see people like them. You want to see women also rising, so you can think to yourself, oh, that could be me. Think of all we have so many young Black tennis players now because of the Venus and Serena Williams. You need to see someone like you. Usually, it has a ripple effect. So I think to the extent that identity politics means different types of people get elevated, it's healthy. And also those different types of people have different perspectives, different lived experiences. So they go in a room and they talk with one another. Ideally, that's the way politics is supposed to work, is you're supposed to represent your district. You're supposed to bring your perspective into the room with other diverse perspectives and districts, and then hammer out, at the national level, a policy that works for all of America. And right now that's not working as well as we would have liked. Although this past year has been, I've been surprised by the legislation that has passed in a really tough political environment. Let's take that one, and then I think we should go to the Zoom, right? Well, truths. Okay, so what happens is the Russians will say, there's racism in America, and they'll highlight something like that. So yes, that's a truth. And they'll try to make us angry about it, right? And if that anger is just, you guys stink, and it's not channeled in a constructive way, then the Russians win, right? But there are untruths, like COVID. They had COVID disinformation. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was that they were telling us. That they were telling, there was something about the vaccine. So they were saying vaccines don't work, right? It was anti-vax. Meanwhile, the Russians are telling their population to get vaccinated. So there were two messages that they were spreading, domestically versus internationally, and that could be tracked, on social media, for example. So how do you exercise your judgment? I think you guys are in academia, who has a license to tell you something. It's somebody who has a PhD, or if it's about medicine, a medical degree. I don't want to hear from my brother-in-law about what to do about COVID. I want to talk to my doctor about it. So you always try to find someone in a position of authority, if you can, to give you the facts. And, you read lots of, I would say, what they call the mainstream media when they're disparaging media sources like the New York Times or Washington Post, they're giving you, yes, a picture, a snapshot, but they have an editorial board, at least, which a lot of the internet sites or blogs or some of these more opinion-facing things on the internet or something someone puts on Facebook, there's no editorial board, no boss to say, did you get at least 2 sources saying this, that the Russians did this? There's certain criteria that the media still have and they hold themselves to. And it doesn't mean that they're perfect and they don't fall for, a government line. Like, for example, some of the press fell for some of the arguments that were made in the run up to the the Iraq War in 2003, 2004. There are times when the media can get something wrong, but generally speaking, there's so much competition in the mainstream media and these editorial boards that it does provide some level of protection against sheer disinformation.
Okay, we have a question online from Sophia, and this is her question. We've been talking a lot in class about the importance of support systems for female candidates. And I know you talked about how important your sister was. My question is, do you think you need both institutional and personal support to feel empowered as a candidate? How can institutional support change a candidacy?
Yeah, so I mentioned before Emily's list supporting me. And then I also did, I got endorsements from various people who were really establishment people. My highest level endorser on the national front was John Kerry, Secretary Kerry. But I had other members of Congress endorsing me. I had Republicans supporting me. I didn't trumpet their endorsement necessarily because it was a Democratic primary, but I think having people who are not institutions, but they represent institutions, they're established, they're respected, saying this woman is the woman I would vote for if I were you was really significant. I had the closest person to here, I guess, I'm trying to think, I had Donna Shalala, that's Florida. So I had a number of members of Congress, not just from New York and New Jersey area. But I think having the people supporting you around you, it's a different kind of support.
Another question here. Kento asks, he says, it's not about American politics, but do you believe that democratic liberation would take place in Russia? Since the latest Russian public opinion shows that Putin's support has really gone down, has decreased. And so Kento just wants to know.
So I wish I could tell you all what is going to happen to the future of politics in Russia. It's very hard to predict. First of all, because those polls that they give in Russia, it's not a really free democratic country, and people are intimidated when they're asked. Some people will speak freely, and there's not like 100% fear there or intimidation, but many people will just say what they think the pollster wants to hear or what they think they're supposed to say, especially in a society like that. It happens also, obviously, in free societies, but so we don't really know how popular or unpopular Putin is, but certainly if there's already a poll that indicates his popularity is sinking, and there are more people on the street in more cities than you've seen in quite some time because of the basically this partial mobilization of people to fight in a war that we know is unpopular. We know it anecdotally, we know it. I mean, I think every Russian and Ukrainian would tell you, we don't want to be at war with Ukraine. The president of Russia, President Putin, has portrayed the war as a war to save Ukraine from the West and from those NATO countries and from fascist Ukrainians. So he's spun it, but they're starting to realize that that might not be true. And also too many people are dying. So if they get drafted, they'll likely die, or their son will die, or their brother will die, or their husband will die. So I do believe that Putin is in a very dangerous spot right now because he does need more military bodies. This 300,000 partial mobilization, he's not going to get 300,000 anytime soon, and he doesn't have enough equipment or training to get them in the battlefield very quickly. He may eventually be tempted to a full mobilization, and then that really could cause people to go to the streets and cause change in Russia. It's not entirely out of the realm of the possible that the Russian people, in that scenario, they would rise up and they would say enough. Part of what caused the Soviet Union to collapse was a very unpopular Afghan war. And it was the mothers of the Afghan soldiers, and they had an organization with a name roughly along those lines, who went and confronted and demonstrated and complained to the Soviet government at the time. And they did contribute to the loss of legitimacy of that Soviet government, which eventually led to Gorbachev and the attempt at reform, which of course then led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you don't know what dynamic can incur. And if Putin takes the wrong step, he could lose power. What will come after him? We don't know. It could be Alexei Navalny, someone who's Western friendly, or at least more Western friendly, still a nationalist Russian, of course, but not in a way that's anti-Western. Also somebody who understands how democracy works, freedom of expression, et cetera. And, or you could get one of Putin's cronies to come after him, in which case you may have a less aggressive foreign and defense policy, but you still may not have a very Western friendly government, and you still may have their very corrupt economic system and oppressive political system. Okay.
So you mentioned earlier the concept of like integrity-driven voting or like character-driven, but like you see so many instances of that, like of powerful politicians like saying that they will go towards something, but then they do the exact opposite. Do you think that delegitimizes democracy, and how do we go about addressing that? Get more involved in politics.
Right, right. So I think it depends on what they're compromising on. Sometimes compromise is necessary in order to achieve even your larger objectives. Sometimes you compromise on a piece of legislation. But if it's truly your values you're compromising on, then I think it's cowardly, and you are giving up a piece of your soul and part of our fabric of politics. So I would say that we should encourage our leaders to stick to their values and to stick to what they believe in and reward them for that. But it's hard, I understand. There are small trade-offs that you make sometimes. For example, right now in the context of adopting the legislation on energy, climate, et cetera, what they call the Inflation Reduction Act. In that context, some environmentalists had to give to some energy extraction industry supporters like Senator Manchin in exchange for other things they wanted, or like the health care components of that bill. So there are trade-offs you make like that. You can't be a purist all the time, but on the big issues, like was this election free and fair, and was it certified rightfully so by all these courts, by the state legislature, by the courts, by the Congress, those types of things you don't want to compromise on. So the question is, how have the lessons learned in running for Congress informed my experience at the McCain Institute? So I've only been at the Institute about 5 months. So I might have to come back and answer that question. But I mean, certainly, running for Congress, you are putting yourself out there. You're being, to my mind, you have to be an authentic person. That's also the way that I got those Marines to respect me. I didn't pretend I was a 60-year-old man. I just was the 30-year-old woman. And eventually they realized I knew something and I could teach them something. So I think just being true to myself, being myself, I learned to do that when I was running for Congress, and I'm doing the same. I think caring about people, having empathy and grace You learn that in campaigns. You also learn, you know, how to lead by example. So for example, if let's say there had been something that happened on my campaign that was that involved a human resources problem, and we acted very quickly on such a thing. That is a type of experience because it validates. Once you do something right, it actually strengthens you. So now I know anytime I'm confronted again in the future by something like that, I will do what I did that time, which was very strong, quick action to say that's not acceptable, sayonara to the offenders. And so again, I think you learn through your experience, but you get strengthened by the good decisions you make. We had one in the back there. Okay, so I'm not sure I heard all of that. So my views on, what are my views on? Okay, millennial activism. So first I have to make a correction. So even though I didn't speak English till I went to kindergarten, I actually was born here. It's just that I was the oldest child and I was in my family home until I went to kindergarten. With regard to millennial activism, I think it's great, and we need more activism by more young people because, you know, the older people, especially as they get older, you know, they have different concerns, and also they weren't raised, many of the people older than myself weren't raised with an awareness of the environment and all that education that you guys get every day, whether it's through television or in your classrooms. They didn't have that. And they kind of vaguely know Al Gore was, you know, after he was vice president, he put out that movie. And, you know, I would make a joke like when I was telling people, no, you can't run the dishwasher yet. Like Al Gore would not approve. We have to fill it all the way up, you know. So there was a sense of consciousness in my generation because of him and things we were learning. But my sister, who's 11 years younger than me, she was much more conscientious, and she does things like in Maryland, she cuts down invasive species as a volunteer. I think she's called a weed whacker or something like that. Anyway, but she literally does this. So the more, and that's an example, by the way, of activism. You know, she's going out there, she's volunteering, she goes on Facebook, she shows the trees, you know. I then learned from her to identify the bad vines. And then I took a picture and I sent it somewhere where there was only one tree in this area. And I thought, well, I'm in the city and that one tree goes away. It's so hot in Washington, D.C. We need that one tree. So she figured out how I could get someone to come and do that same thing. So we need more voices. We need more activism, everything from community level all the way up. We want to go to Zoom maybe? Or while you do that, I'll look for someone in a part of the room I didn't call on there.
Last night I was watching the Arizona debate, and one of the candidates admitted that he wants to decertify the 2020 election. He believes it's rigged. And in Arizona, that's a really common thing with a lot of candidates, that they mistrust our election system. How do you think we go about combating that mistrust of democracy in both our candidates and with the voters on a local level?
Well, I would say get involved in volunteering at your local polling station. Make sure you vote yourself. So the question was about how do we combat this lack of trust in government that exists in Arizona, especially now looking at the Arizona Attorney General race and the debate last night. And I think if you can go and volunteer at a polling station, you can see for yourselves. If you can go and vote, of course, you'll see for yourselves. The more you participate actively, the more you'll see. The other thing is to support local journalism, because local journalists, they're like watchdogs. You know, they'll be there, they'll write, they'll cover it. And so long as they're independent journalists, they're not influenced by some one party or another. You can actually, you know, get a good, accurate picture of whether, you know, the process was free and fair. Hill is the same thing. So the McCain Institute does have internships, so he can apply for internships with us. There are also other internships that think tanks have. We're not really a think tank. We get stuff done. We don't churn out papers, but we give you a great experience, you know, promoting democracy through our events, through our training things that we do in Arizona and Texas and elsewhere, through our big convenings, including the Sedona Forum, which students will be invited to attend also. I would say, you know, the more networking he can do, try to get out of the house and meet people, ask them for coffee, apply for internships. It can be hard sometimes to break in, but if you are persistent, you can prevail. And again, the McCain Institute internships are posted. You just need some kind of experience where someone can watch you work. And if you have to, volunteer, and you can volunteer in a campaign, and you never know where that will take you as well, because the campaign doesn't care because they're not paying you and they need bodies. And you can actually really distinguish yourself by working hard. Of course, he's got a lot on his plate, so it may be something he can't do immediately.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farkas. I think this was enlightening. We covered a lot of bases. My students really wanted to come to the talk, and so thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thanks.